Yes, with the Western theme is going to be so much fun. The woodpecker song and all the different songs we're listening to, getting ready for VBS already, picking them out. Buddy, what's the guy's name at the?
Buddy Green.
No, that's
Buddy.
I know. I was thinking Buddy Green too. Was he's the harmonica guy.
Yeah,
Buddy Green is, but down at the
yeah.
thing, yeah, and here. All right, you're all up and running, Bill.
All right, welcome. Thankful for all of those who weathered the weather to get here tonight. Kind of nasty out there, but you persevered and came out anyway. And maybe there's some people that are watching by way of YouTube as well, so we're glad for those people. If you are watching on YouTube and you do not have a workbook, you can either email me, and I don't have that up there, but I just take my name, William D. Henry II, with no periods and no caps, at gmail.com. Send me an email and I'll email you the lessons that we're doing. If you can stop by the church building sometime during the week, you can pick up a workbook here. All right, let's have a word of prayer and we'll get started with our study tonight. Thank you, Lord, for being our Father. You are the great God, the creator of all things through the Lord Jesus Christ. You've given us so much information about Jesus. It's hard to imagine what our faith would be like if we didn't know Jesus through the Gospels. And our purpose is to learn more and more about him as we study together. I pray you would guide our time and help us to observe the things that we need to observe and to understand what we need to understand in order to appreciate the Lord Jesus and you as our Father even more. I pray that you would guide us in all things in such a way as to bring glory to yourself. And we ask these things in the name of our Lord and Savior, Jesus. Amen. All right, in case you've wandered in, didn't know what this is the life of Christ. As we look at the harmony of the Gospels, we here in the class, many people have purchased a copy of Harmony of the Gospels. This particular edition is the Christian Standard Bible, which is, and this particular edition has a lot of good notes. And we're going to be using that as we look at the harmony together. It's a lot easier to look at, especially parts where the synoptic gospels are covering the same material, to have all that together on one page rather than flipping back and forth. The last time we were together, I gave you an assignment, someone reminded me, on page 15 of our workbook to do number 21, and that is to read those verses and summarize their meaning in relation to the point which is above, which I don't know, did we fill in that point or we're waiting to go through the verses? We filled it in? Okay. So in relation to creation, his identity in relationship to creation. All right, so if anybody looked up the verses and wrote something down, what did you write as the relation of Jesus to the creation? And make sure everybody, if you answer, speak loudly. I know you may be reticent to do that, but the people who are listening or watching at home need to hear you. Okay, go ahead. You started. Okay, so that's the one big idea there, is that Jesus Christ is the creator. Now, we generally think of just God being the creator, but we know specifically that person of the Godhead that was behind creation was Jesus Christ. All right, and anything else? Okay, so a word we can use for that is agent. So an agent is someone who acts on behalf of someone else, or the one through whom something is done. Jesus Christ is the one. If we can say God created, and by that mean all three persons of the triunity are the creators, but specifically of the three, Jesus is the agent through whom creation took place. So that's a good word to use. Anybody else have anything in addition to the fact that he is the creator? It's kind of an implication that you might have gotten from a couple of the verses. Okay, good. Those are all things that are true. Okay, so one of the implications of the fact that Jesus Christ is the creator is that if you look at creation, it's evident that it was created, right? And so that is something that everyone can understand, at least that much. In fact, even the atheist Richard Dawkins would concede that. Interesting. I heard him actually say in an interview that you could walk out your back door. Richard Dawkins, in case you don't know, is one of the foremost atheists of today. He is what might be called a militant atheist. He writes strongly against theism. His most well-known book is called The God Delusion. And he says that if you were to walk out your back door and look around at nature around you, you would think that it had been created because of the order and the design that's evident there. And oh yeah, that's right. But then he adds, but you'd be wrong. Based on what? Because Richard Dawkins says so, not because of your own observations. So that's an important part of this too. There's one more thing that I added as an implication of this, and that is that since Jesus Christ is the creator, he receives glory from his creation. And so that's an implication or a result of him being the creator. He receives glory. Okay, good. Let's go to point number 22. Do you have a question, John, or a comment? Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, and especially when you have so-called Christian organizations or churches denying the deity of God, do you think, have you ever read John 1? It's pretty obvious there, which is where we're specifically looking. Okay, so that was from verse 3, his identity and relationship to creation. Now, let's look at verses 4 and 5, and then 10 through 13. We should, since it's been a week since we read this, maybe we should read these verses again. Would someone read verses 4 and 5 out of our harmony on page 24? Verses 4 and 5. Okay, then let's read verses 10 through 13. Someone else?
He was in the world, and the world was created through him, and yet the world did not recognize him. He came to his own, and his own people did not receive him. But to all who did receive him, he gave them the right to be children of God, to those who believe on his name, who were born not of natural descent, or of the will of the flesh, or of the will of man, but of God.
All right, so we see here his identity in relationship to men. So number 23, how would you answer this? He is the source of all what? Life. He is the source of all life. Okay, everybody with us? Number 23, the source of all life. Number 24, he is the revealer of what? Light. The revealer of light, or the knowledge of God. The revealer of light. Now, what's the irony of John 1:10? Do you remember what irony is back when you're in school? What's the irony of John 1:10? Right. Yes, that's exactly right. So the creator of the world wasn't known by those whom he created, or however you want to put it. The one who created was not known by those whom he created. All right, number 26, we need to use our Bibles. If anybody brought a Bible, you have your harmony, so you might not have, but if you have a Bible, turn to Romans chapter 1. We're going to look at verses 18 to 23. Romans 1. '18 to 23. I want to read these verses and summarize their meaning in relation to this point, this last point, that the creator of the world wasn't known by those whom he created. So Romans 1, 18 to 23 says this: "For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men who suppress the truth in unrighteousness, because that which is known about God is evident within them, for God made it evident to them. For since the creation of the world, his invisible attributes, his eternal power and divine nature have been clearly seen, being understood through what has been made, so that they are without excuse. For even though they knew God, they did not honor him as God or give thanks, but they became futile in their speculations, and their foolish heart was darkened. Professing to be wise, they became fools, and exchanged the glory of the incorruptible God for an image in the form of corruptible man, and of birds, and four-footed animals, and crawling creatures." So, how would you summarize those verses concerning the point made in the previous question? Yeah, deliberate ignorance. That's a good way of putting that. They suppress the truth deliberately or willingly. They're willingly ignorant of him. Even though all of creation points to a creator, they are willingly or deliberately ignorant or deny his existence. I will pause for a few minutes and let you address whatever comes to your mind about the conflict between light and darkness. And if you want to address it on a physical level first, that'd be good. Or if you want to jump into the spiritual application, you can do that as well. But the conflict between light and darkness, John uses it here. What comes to your mind about that?
That I wrote down is that light is light and darkness is death. And it just came to me just now that Jesus is light and evil is darkness.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, good. Yeah, that's a real contrast, isn't it? Okay, explain that in a physical sense. Is that that's what, yeah. And that's what I think John has in mind here when he says the darkness has not overcome it. If you have light, darkness can't overcome light. Correct? And I like the way you put that, Sheila. The light chases away the darkness. And then that's true spiritually as well, that Jesus Christ as the light cannot be overcome by the darkness, which is death or evil. So John uses things that are purely physical for us to understand that which is spiritual. All right, good comments. Anybody else? Any other comments you'd like to make about the conflict between light and darkness?
Turned on, we can see what those realities are. See what is reality. And he's there whether the lights are on or off.
Yeah. Okay, good. It reveals what is there all along. Yeah. Any other comments about light and darkness? So glad to have thinking people here in this room. Because yeah, I'm used to doing this in a classroom of teenagers, and oftentimes it's like deer in headlights. There's anybody have an answer, anybody at all. So glad you guys are responding. All right, I don't know whether we want to do too much with the chart, number 28. Look at the following chart, be prepared to explain it. That would have maybe presupposed that you had a chance to look it over. But just in glancing at it, are there any things that stand out to you? Not that you have to have a grand explanation of anything there, but just looking at the chart that somebody made up here and comparing the pre-incarnate Christ with the ascended Lord. So before and after his earthly life. As John is giving us an insight into the pre-incarnate Christ. I think one thing we could say is Jesus Christ is the author of original creation and of the new creation, right? He's in charge of both those things. Interesting, if you look down at the bottom, in the book of Philippians, the Apostle Paul deals with the fact that Jesus surrendered his glory in coming down to earth, and in ascending, glory was restored to him. You find that all in Philippians chapter 2, a great passage.
Just always there. Time he walked with God for Jesus in the cool of the morning. And he ate the apple and the light switch was turned off. That didn't make Jesus any less there.
Mm-hmm.
Until
Yeah.
his birth, when we could see him again, he was still always there.
Mm-hmm.
And always with us.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, good.
A
think that's the interesting thing in our Bible studies. We've had women, and I'm not being critical of this, but women that are not understood, and the light that goes on with them, that Jesus just didn't appear on December 25th. You know?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
There's no time in Jesus.
Yeah, and especially if you study the Old Testament and find all the times when I believe it was the Son appeared to people in the Old Testament, what we call theophanies or Christophanies, Christ appearing in human form, although not being human, but in appearance of humanity in order to communicate to different people, and how over and over again we find who we would know in the New Testament as Jesus throughout, and not to mention all the prophecies concerning Jesus. All right, let's see if we can fill in number 29 then. He was considered by the people that should have known him a blasphemous impostor worthy of death. Number 30. Jesus is the initiator into, how would you fill that blank with God? Fellowship with God would be good. Any other words that you could fit in there?
Or even abiding.
Just say abiding?
Yeah.
Into abiding with God?
Yeah.
Okay, so, and that indicates relationship. Yeah. The word I use is one that encompasses all those things as a biblical word to indicate relationship, fellowship. Starts with a C. Covenant. So not that, yours aren't wrong, but that's, if you want to get 100% on this, you need to have the word covenant in there. No, just kidding. This is all about us learning, not about having necessarily the exact answer that the teacher has. Jesus is the initiator into covenant with God. Oh, and by the way, I wanted to mention too that as I have looked over the materials that we're using, and understanding my normal procedure of tearing apart every word, that can't happen if we're going to get through the entire life of Jesus. I was listening to, I found a podcast just yesterday of a guy who did something similar to this. So I started listening to it. Might pick up a few things. And he said this was his second time doing it. And the first time it took him 7 years. And so we don't want to take that much time. So there are going to be places where we're not going to go into a lot of depth. But I don't want to keep that from you from asking questions. If there's something in a verse or a passage that you have a question about, feel free to ask it. We'll take the time to go into it. But just don't expect the kind of in-depth look at that we might get on Sunday morning at Adult Bible Fellowship. All right, so we're looking at verse 12, and the simple question that I have for you there is, what is the invitation in verse 12? What are the words used there for the invitation? Receive him, yeah. For as many as received him. So the invitation is to receive him. And then number 32, and if I start going too fast, faster than you can write, just wave, and I'll know to slow down a little bit. number 32, what is the result of this? Right, adoption into God's family, become sons of God. And there's another word they're used for how this happens. To them, he gave the right to become sons of God, or the authority to become sons of God, or the power to become sons of God. So it's not just that we're adopted, but we have the authority to be adopted. This is the result of our receiving him. All right, number 33 is a tricky one for many people. Who or what initiates this birth as sons of God? Becoming a son of God is being born again, but who or what initiates that? Okay, in verse 12, I'm sorry, verse 13. In verse 13, I didn't put the verse down, my bad. So you're right about the Holy Spirit, but according to what it says in verse 13, who or what initiates our birth? Yes, and specifically the will of God. So we see here, we see a lot in Christian culture, emphasis on the will of man, but we're told here that it's not the will of man that brings about this new birth, it's the will of God. The will of God is what initiates this entrance into being a son of God. All right, does that make sense in the verse, verse 13? All right, number 34. I think we'll leave that blank as a blank until we look through the following questions, and then you can come back and see what you think goes in that heading. Okay? So, first of all, number 35. This is a thinking question. And we probably need to read, I have the verses at the very beginning of this, but we haven't read them this week. So let's look at verse 14. Would someone like to read verse 14 for us? And we'll just go that far. All right. So the question is, what is the significance of John's use of the word? And let's see, in the version we're using, it is dwelt among us. I think a lot of the translations have dwelt among us, but or made his dwelling. But the actual word there is tabernacled. So what's the significance of John using the word tabernacled among us here? What does that indicate when he says that Jesus, or the word tabernacled among us? Now presupposes knowing what a tabernacle is. Go ahead, Sheila. Yeah, and what you used a word there, dwelling among his people, and something else about that dwelling. It's physical, and what else? Pardon me? It's temporary. So he's temporarily dwelling here. Now that's not to say that he doesn't retain his bodily presence even after ascending, but he's just here for a short time. And I think John's intentional in using that word tabernacled among us. He's here on a temporary basis and here physically. I like that you use that word as well, as a temporary living arrangement. All right, any comments or questions about that? hmm And I think this was in Sheila's definition too. What was the purpose of the tabernacle and or temple? Yeah. So even those physical structures were to symbolize at least God's dwelling among his people. And so John uses that same word for Jesus. If you ever study the Gospel of John, and I mean study it, you will be amazed at the words that how precise John's wording is to communicate. Okay, number 36, according to John's record, what is the great significance of the birth of Jesus? In verse 14. What is the great significance of the birth of Jesus? Say that again. He became visible. Okay, that's true. Look at tell me from the words that are there in verse 14. How did he become visible? The word became flesh. So from the beginning of John's gospel, we've been seeing the word, and we know that the word was God, and he's the creator, and we're seeing all these things about the word. And then in verse 14, he says, the word became flesh. Maybe I should have had this question before the tabernacle one in order, but the fact that the word or God became flesh or man, that God became man, that is the significance of the birth of Jesus. Think of all the things that people consider at Christmas time and talking about the true meaning of Christmas and all of that. Well, it's really summarized in what John says here, that God became flesh, that God became man. All right, now we'll go on to the next part of the verse with a thinking question. Discuss the significance of the description full of grace and truth. What does that indicate, or what does that tell us about the word? Full of grace and truth. This is multifaceted, so there's not like one right answer, but what comes to your mind? What are you thinking when you see that expression, full of grace and truth, about the word?
So a lot of standards can be subjective. Will a standard becomes object.
Hmm.
So if God is the standard, then that's all. I'm not going to go into grace, I'm going to truth. Then that standard becomes a reality.
Mm-hmm.
All things are positionally related to it.
Mm-hmm.
It's how far away, how near, how right, how wrong. All that comes out of this one pattern.
Yes, and so Jesus, or the word, is the embodiment of what is true. And I couldn't help thinking, John, when you're talking about my truth, your truth, that's not true. There is truth, and that's not it. But Jesus is it. He is truth. In fact, he even said that later on, didn't he? I am the way, the truth, and the life. So he is the embodiment of truth.
And it's not true. One thing.
And what about the grace part? It's full of grace. What is grace? And we should define that first. Right, unmerited favor. Getting what we don't deserve. So as Jesus is reflecting what is true of God, the triunity, and even God the Father, he's full of truth. He's also full of grace. Why does John put that here? Why does he put these two things together? Is there anything that would lead you to believe that would lead you to believe of what we've seen so far concerning the Word, who he is, what's happened to him, to which the idea of grace would be a welcome surprise?
Another thing is Jesus being the way, the truth, and the life. Without that, I mean, we're undeserving of that life.
Mm-hmm.
So that's where the grace comes in.
And since we've just seen that men reject him, even though he's created them, they reject him, and that's the normal response, that grace would be something that would be unexpected. He is the creator. So being full of grace as well as truth is something that John chose to emphasize at this point in talking about him becoming flesh, tabernacling among us. We didn't talk about the fact that John says we've seen his glory, the glory of the one and only Son who came from the Father, and that coming from the Father, he is full of grace and truth. And they saw that in him day to day. All right, let's look at verse 15. Well, verse 15 is parenthetical concerning John the Baptist, introduced here all of a sudden. Well, continuing from verse 6 above, John testified concerning him and exclaimed, "This was the one of whom I said, the one coming after me ranks ahead of me because he existed before me." So John the Apostle just pointing out that John the Baptist was in agreement with what he's been saying, that the Word existed before them. He was pre-existent. But continuing with the grace idea, verse 16, "Indeed, we have all received grace upon grace from his fullness, for the law was given through Moses, grace and truth came through Jesus Christ." All right, how would you contrast Moses with Jesus?
Because the grace and the following.
Right. Yeah, the law was never meant to save. It was to point out to us our inability to keep God's standard, to save ourselves. And so John contrasts Moses with Jesus, the incomplete revelation that came from the law, in a sense. Grace more fully understood and truth incarnate came through Jesus. Jesus completed the picture, if you will. Any other comments concerning Moses and Jesus? Mm-hmm. Yeah, because he kept it. And, right. Yeah. And not only fulfilled it in keeping it, but also in satisfying the requirements of the law judicially and the sacrificial system. Let's look at verse 18. No one has ever seen God, the one and only Son, who is himself God and is at the Father's side. He has revealed him. All right, what's the significance of that verse? Okay, he's a revealer of God. Why is it that no one has ever seen God? Why do we need Jesus to reveal him to us? Somebody kind of mentioned this about 20, 30 minutes ago.
Christians. As having walked with God in the full of the moon, we saw God. But he was separated from God from that point forward. It was a history. Everything else has seen God. So I've always wondered why that phrase is not right. One person saw it. Why does he walk with him?
Well, does that mean that he actually saw him, though? Remember what God said to Moses when Moses begged him to see him face to face? Yeah. But what did God say? What did God say to Moses? He said, "Man, no man can see me and live. No one can see me and live." Now, you could argue that Adam in a pre-sinful state maybe saw him, but just because God was walking with him doesn't mean that he actually saw him either. And we could go into all kinds of speculation as to maybe it was a theophany, maybe he took on a human appearance so that he could walk with Adam, whatever. But when it says here that no one can see or no one has ever seen God, that has to mean no one has ever seen him as he really is, without having some kind of a covering, like a human form or whatever. And why is that? Why is it no one can see God? It's a very simple explanation. Don't make it too hard. That's part of it is his glory. What else? What is our sin makes it impossible to be in his presence in a sense, but what is it that makes it impossible for us to see him? You're making it too hard. Why? Can you see oxygen? No, it's impossible for you to see oxygen, right? Speak up. Speak up. You can't see God because he is spirit. So that's why it says then, the one and only Son, who is himself God and is at the Father's side, he has revealed him. Why? Because it goes back to verse 14, the word became flesh and dwelt among us. So the only way we can see God is if he becomes flesh, which is what Jesus did. Remember what Jesus said to his disciples, if you've seen me, you've seen the Father. Otherwise, they couldn't see God, but they saw God in Jesus Christ because he took on flesh. So in becoming fully human, Jesus reveals to us God. And then through this revelation, people may come to know the Father. All right. Any questions? Mm-hmm. Good. Yes. Yeah. Yeah, it's one of those great words that John uses, like tabernacled and exegeted, and there's a lot of that in John's gospel. Thanks for bringing that up. Oh, yes. I knew I would forget. All right. Um, no, I see, I closed my notes for that part and have to remind myself, what is that? Oh, so what do you think goes in the blank of number 34? Anybody else? Oh, so that was John's idea. Revelation, what did you say, Sheila? Son? I think with all that we saw in those verses, I think the best, even though all the answers you've given are correct, but the best word I think we could use is incarnation. And what does incarnation mean? What does incarnation mean? Do we hear that word? Maybe we don't hear it enough in Christian circles. What is incarnation? Yeah, it's Jesus becoming man. It's God becoming man. That's the incarnation. The incarnation. You may hear the word used in other ways. He's the incarnation of his grandfather because he's a lot like him. But in reality, the word itself refers to the word becoming flesh, God becoming man, the incarnation. Such an important theological concept. All right, we got that. We filled in that blank after all. Thank you, Marcia, for reminding us. All right. Let's move on to page 17. We're starting a new section, and unfortunately, we can't control the time so that we start a section at the beginning of our time. Here we are. That's just the way it's going to go. So in this section, we're going to see the introduction of the king. And this is going to cover sections 3 through 27. If you look in your harmony, you can see the different sections there. Section 3 in part 3 on page 25 of your harmony. And as we look at the introduction of the king, first we have the arrival of the king in sections 3 through 19. And so we begin with section 3, which is the genealogy of the king. What is a genealogy? Family tree. Yeah, that's a good way of putting it. And we see that it is given to us in Matthew 1 and Luke 3. If you look in your harmony, you'll see them side by side. That's the advantage of the harmony. We can see them both here. And so we can read down through the genealogy of Jesus Christ, the son of David, the son of Abraham in Matthew and on down. And then we can read the genealogy in Luke 3, which begins with he's the son of Joseph, son of Heli, and so on. Now, I wish that we had time, because it's kind of tedious for us to read through all of this here together. And maybe the best thing, let's see, do I have? Oops, I forgot to put that one up. And I need to move to another slideshow. Well, I'll tell you what, I want to look over these genealogies, kind of glance down through it, and see if you can tell me some contrasts or some differences or what's similar. Okay, so we've got so-and-so fathered another person, and then the other one is talking about being the son of somebody. Okay. let's see, do I have in, if you look on page 19, it might help a little bit. Although you won't see the order in which they each put them, so maybe that's not such a great help after all. Well, let's go back to your harmony, page 25, and tell me in Matthew, where does he start? Okay, well, yeah, son of David, the son of Abraham. So the furthest back he goes is Abraham. Now, why does he do that? Why particularly is Matthew interested in starting with Abraham? So why Abraham? And many sons? Why is Matthew starting with Abraham? Okay, let me rephrase this. Think about what we learned concerning the four gospel writers and to whom they're writing. To whom is Matthew writing his gospel? So why does he start with Abraham? He's the father of the Jews. So he wants to make sure he can trace it back to Abraham. He starts with Abraham and goes through, and you're familiar with these different people, Isaac, Jacob, Judah, all that on down through. Eventually you get to verse 5. Salmon fathered Boaz by Rahab. You remember Rahab? Boaz fathered Obed by Ruth. Obed fathered Jesse, and Jesse fathered King David. So that's kind of a major point here, because the Messiah has to come from David. And then you have David fathered Solomon by Uriah's wife. Solomon fathered Rehoboam, and then you go skip on down through, and you get to, you have to turn the page. After the exile to Babylon, you have some more people, and you get down to verse 16. Jacob fathered Joseph, the husband of Mary, who gave birth to Jesus, who is called the Messiah. And then Matthew tells us that he arranged this in groups of 14 for easier memorization. So, and we know that he left out a few people here and there in order to get 14. So it's not really important that he left out a few people. We just have these three groups. All right, so it starts with Abraham and ends with whom? Before Jesus. Joseph, the husband of Mary. Now, that is kind of an interpretive translation by the Christian Standard Version, not necessarily clear if you're looking at the Greek, but we'll leave that for now. Let's look over at Luke. It says that Jesus was thought to be the son of Joseph, son of Heli. So what is that saying? And again, this is a little bit of interpretive translation. He was thought to be the son of Joseph. So what's that saying? Yeah. So Luke is going the opposite direction. He's not going at the beginning. He's starting with Jesus and going backwards. Okay, everybody see that? And he's saying that Jesus was thought to be the son of Joseph. Was he the son of Joseph, the biological son of Joseph? No. But often in genealogies, the husband was put in place of the wife because the women were not as considered as important. Now, interesting that when we look at Matthew, before we come back to Luke, look back down through Matthew again. And you'll see that there are a number of women named. Okay, what women can you pick out there? Rahab, Ruth, they're right together there. Who else? Tamar. There's at least one more. One more that's not, we're not given a name. Uriah's wife. All right, now, do you know enough about these four women to be able to tell me what they all have in common? They're what? Less than spotless. Yeah. Would you like to elaborate? Or yeah, Bathsheba was, yep. Tamar, not David. Goes back further. Yep. What verse is Tamar? Verse 3 says Judah fathered Perez and Zerah by Tamar. Anybody remember the circumstances there? No. Tamar was married to Judah's son, who died before they had any children. And remember, what was the law concerning a man dying childless? What would his wife be required to do? Marry a brother, and the firstborn would be considered the son of the dead husband. So she was supposed to marry one of her husband's brothers. Judah was supposed to take care of that, but he didn't. In fact, I'm trying to remember now, did he do it for one more and he died too? Or that may be the case. But at any rate, he failed to supply what was necessary for her. And so she dressed up like a prostitute and seduced Judah and became pregnant by him because he failed to do what he was supposed to do. So Tamar has, as John said, is less than spotless. Okay, so we've mentioned Rahab, Tamar. So what about Ruth? What's wrong with Ruth? The same thing is true of Ruth as was true of Bathsheba and of Rahab. Has nothing to do with sexual morality. None of them were Hebrew. So they're outside of the Hebrew people. And yet Matthew includes them specifically in the genealogy. Now, we won't spend a lot of time on that particular feature, but it is an interesting thing. And I think it's emphasizing the grace of God, even in the genealogy of Jesus. All right, so the genealogy of on Matthew's account ends, well, let's go back to Luke first. So Luke begins with Jesus supposed to be the son of Joseph, and then it goes on through, and it ends up, well, let's see, let's go to verse 30. Okay, what do you notice in verse 30? Compare verse 30 of Luke 3 with verse 6 of Matthew 1. And consider that these are both genealogies. I mean, oh, maybe not 30. Not 30, 31. Yeah, 31. I'm sorry, not 30. What's similar about verse 31 in Luke and verse 6 in Matthew? Yeah, it's hard. That's why I was confused, because the 31 is tiny right before. What's the same in Matthew verse 6 and Luke verse 31? All right, so in both of these genealogies, David is listed, correct? Everybody see that? All right, now what's different? What was that? One says king, one doesn't. Okay. Something more significant than that, although that we'll come back to that. The fact that it says that he's King David. In Luke, it doesn't say King David. What else is different? All right. Through whom, through what son of David is the genealogy given in Matthew? Solomon. Through what son is the genealogy given in Luke? Nathan. Ah. So that tells you right there, even if you didn't compare a lot of the other people, that these genealogies are different, and yet in many ways the same. All right, let's continue in Luke. Continue on down, and we see that we get in verse 34, we have Jacob, son of Isaac, son of Abraham, son of Terah, and so on. And then we continue on to verse 37. We have Methuselah, Mahalalel, son of Seth. Okay, you remember Seth? Who is Seth? Well, he's the son that replaced Abel, whom Cain killed. And then son of Adam. So Matthew takes us back to Abraham. Where does Luke take us? All the way back to Adam, and then he adds son of God. All right, what's the deal here? A lot of things going on. All right, first of all, let's return to the reason for the genealogies. And in part goes back to what I think was Elizabeth, did you say about King David? Why does Matthew mention that David is king and Luke doesn't? Think about the audience of each of them. Who's Matthew writing to? Jews. And he wants them to understand what about Jesus? You have to talk louder. The mic's not going to pick you up. Elizabeth? He's the Messiah. And therefore well, they wouldn't necessarily have understood him to be son of God, the Jewish people at that time, but many of them at least understood that the Messiah would be their king. So he is the king. He is royalty. Therefore, he must be descended from royalty, and therefore King David has to be in the list. Coming from Abraham means that he is a Hebrew. Descendant of King David means that he is royalty. All right, so now we come to Luke. Luke doesn't mention David's a king. And he goes all the way back to Adam. Who's Luke's audience? Is Luke's audience Hebrew people. No, they're Greeks. So what is Luke getting across about Jesus? If he takes them all the way back to Adam. He is, well, as Adam was a son of God, he is a son of God, but mostly that he is human, that he is in the human line. He is in the human line that goes all the way back to the first human. That's Luke's point. Luke's point is not that he is king, but that he is human and the son of God by virtue of his relationship there. All right, now, why do we have differences between the two genealogies? This could be a long explanation, but I'll try not to make it so. The genealogy of Matthew, I'm sorry, first, the genealogy of Luke is to demonstrate that Jesus is human all the way back, but also he is in the line of David, which means that he fulfills the obligation to be born in the line of David, because he is born, as we're told at the very beginning of Luke's, it says, thought to be son of Joseph, son of Heli. But if you look at Matthew's account in verse 15, we're told that Jacob fathered Joseph, the husband of Mary. What we have here is that in Luke, he is substituting Joseph for Mary as her husband. Heli is not the father of Joseph. Heli is the father of Mary. So this is Mary's genealogy, fulfilling the obligation for the Messiah to be in the line of David. Not talking about him being king, but just to be the Messiah, he had to be in the line of David. Matthew gives us the genealogy of Joseph, because it's through Joseph that the royal line comes. That's why there are differences. Do you follow so far? Now, the reason for that is because of something that occurred just before the exile into Babylon. The kings of Judah, the southern kingdom of Judah, remember, after the death of Solomon, the kingdom of Israel divided into two. 10 tribes were the northern kingdom of Israel, 2 tribes were the southern kingdom of Judah. The 10 tribes that were Israel were ruled by kings that were not in the line of David, and they were all evil, every last one of them. The southern kingdom of Judah always had a descendant of David on the throne, and sometimes they were good and sometimes they were evil. But eventually the evil came to the point where they were judged by God. The northern kingdom was judged by God earlier because they were so wicked and were in idolatry, and the nation of Assyria came down and judged them, brought destruction to them, and separated them all over their territory. The southern kingdom of Judah lasted longer because it did have some good kings. They had the temple, and eventually, though, the king of Babylon, Nebuchadnezzar, came and brought destruction to Jerusalem and the temple. But before that destruction, I had to think, where was I going with this? I've given all this background, I forgot where I was going. Before that final destruction came, there was a king on the throne of Judah whose name was Jehoiakim. Jehoiakim had become a vassal of King Nebuchadnezzar. In other words, Nebuchadnezzar had control over the area, and Jehoiakim had to send money. Well, eventually, Jehoiakim decided, old Nebuchadnezzar, he's kind of far away. This might be a good time for us to cut the strings. And so he didn't send the tribute. He stopped acting as a vassal. So Nebuchadnezzar came with his army to enforce what Jehoiakim was not doing. Jehoiakim also been convinced by some other nations around, hey, let's all join together. If we all join together, we can fight against Nebuchadnezzar. But of course, when time came, the other nations said, no, we didn't say that. I don't know what you're talking about. So Jehoiakim now is in a position where Nebuchadnezzar's coming with his armies, and he's got to pay the piper. Unfortunately for his son Jehoiachin, Jehoiakim died, which left Jehoiachin holding the bag, and Jehoiachin then had to give in to Nebuchadnezzar. But before that happened, God, because of the wickedness of Jehoiakim, God pronounced a curse on Jehoiakim, which included everyone in his line. He said, there'll never be a king successfully ruled from your line. So there's a curse, essentially, on the line of David, on the royal line of David. So how will the Messiah be the king and rule if there's a curse on the line of David, the royal line of David? God already had it solved before it ever started, and that is that Jesus would be in the line of David on the side that was not cursed through David's son Nathan. So he is of the lineage of David, but he receives the right to rule from the royal line, which came through his stepfather Joseph, and he has the right to rule through adoption. So he doesn't receive the curse because Joseph adopts Jesus as his son, and therefore Jesus has the right to rule. Did that make sense? It's a complicated thing, but it's so neat how it all fits together there. All right, so that's looking. There's a lot we could look more we can look at with these genealogies, but I think we'll be satisfied with that. Well, we won't discuss that. Here is the importance of the incarnation through BC. It seems to me that since the fall, without even thinking it odd, that man has had no trouble at all believing that he can be God. How he would do this, I cannot conceive, though he certainly thinks that he can, and yet he cannot bring himself to believe that God can become a man. And there is a difficult to see certificate of birth, including the genealogies. All right, we're going to stop there tonight. I would recommend to you the article that I've included by Chuck Missler on why the virgin birth. I think I included it, didn't I? Is it in there? Oh, I don't see it. I thought I had that in your workbook. Okay, I apologize for that. It's not there, but essentially he goes over some of the same stuff I just told you, that the virgin birth was necessary for a lot of reasons, but one of the reasons was so that Jesus would not receive the curse on the royal line. All right, so next time we will get into some of the prophecies. Number 3, we kind of did the number 1 and 2. If you didn't get some things written down, just next time bring it up and we'll put in some things there. Okay? Any final questions or comments? All right, so we'll plan on beginning with number 3, but we'll go back to 1 and 2 if you need us to fill some things in there. All right? All right, thanks for coming out. Be careful driving home. Take it slow and easy. As I told some of you, I slid on the way in here. So I know the roads are not as good even as they look.